The letter arrived on a Thursday, not digitally, not through any quantum relay or subspace channel. It came printed on actual paper, thick and cream-colored, with a red wax seal pressed into it like a wound. The paper smelled like cedar and old libraries, and the Galactic Concilium senior translator, a being called Vethorum, held it between two of his 6 fingers like it might bite him. He had been translating human communications for 11 years. He had learned their languages, all 412 of them. He had read their poetry, their legal documents, their grocery lists, and their love letters. He thought he understood humans. He read the letter twice. Then he sat down on the floor of his office, which was something his species only did when their legs stopped working from shock. The letter was not long. It was written in plain English, signed by a woman named Director Lena Marsh, and it said the following. To the Galactic Concilium, its member states, and all affiliated bodies, we have tried to reach a peaceful resolution for 31 years. We have sent delegations. We have offered compromises. We have accepted insults, broken treaties, stolen territory, and the deaths of our people with patience that has cost us more than you will ever understand. This letter is formal notice. Earth's restraint ends in 90 days. What comes after is not our preference. It is your consequence. Director Lena Marsh, Earth Diplomatic Corps, Final Communication. Vethorum read it a 3rd time. Then he did something he had never done in 11 years of translation work. He picked up the communication line to the high chamber and said, in his native tongue, the equivalent of, "I think we have made a very serious mistake." Nobody listened to him. That was always how these things started. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Earth had been doing for those 31 years. When humanity first made contact with the Galactic Concilium, they were graded, the way every new species was graded, on the Vithali scale, a measurement of civilizational threat. The scale ran from 1 to 40. A species scoring below 10 was considered harmless. Between 10 and 20, it is manageable. Above 20, worth watching. Above 30, dangerous. Humanity scored a 7. This was not an insult, exactly. It was an assessment. Humans had no unified military command. Their weapons technology was considered primitive. Their ships were slow and fragile. Their biology was unimpressive, soft-skinned, limited sensory range, short-lived. They argued constantly among themselves. They had only been a spacefaring civilization for 60 years. A 7. The Concilium made 3 decisions based on that score. Firstly, they permitted the displacement of human colonies due to Urathi expansion into the Outer Rim territories. 7 was not worth a political argument with a species that scored 26. Second, they permitted the Delvari Trade Collective to impose tariff walls that strangled human commercial routes because economically weakening a primitive species reduced future complications. Third, and most fatally, they ignored every formal complaint Earth filed. Over 31 years, Earth filed 947 formal complaints. 947. Each one carefully worded, legally precise, backed with evidence, and requesting specific and reasonable remedies. None were acknowledged. Inside the Concilium, there was a phrase that junior staff used when another human complaint arrived. They called it Earth noise, the kind of background signal you filter out because it never changes and never matters. What nobody on the Concilium had studied, not seriously, not carefully, was why humanity had scored a 7. It was not because they were weak. It was because they had chosen very deliberately to appear that way. Director Lena Marsh was 54 years old, and she had spent 22 of those years inside the diplomatic apparatus of Earth. She had started as a junior analyst reading Concilium trade law. She had risen, slowly and without drama, through the ranks of a system that rewarded patience over ambition. She was not famous. She was not charismatic. She gave no speeches that anyone would ever replay at a memorial service. She was the kind of person who sat in the back of every room and read every document twice and never said anything until she was certain, and then said it once, quietly, and was almost always right. People who worked with her described her the same way, again and again, without coordinating their descriptions. Still. That was the word they used. Not calm. Not cold. Still. like deep water with no surface movement and no indication of what was underneath or how far down it went. She had been the one, 12 years ago, to recommend against military response when the Urathi displaced the Kepler colony. 40,000 people relocated, their homes taken, their infrastructure dismantled. And Lena Marsh had sat in front of the Earth Assembly and said, in her quiet voice, "Not yet." She had been the one, 8 years ago, to recommend against retaliation when a Delvari trade enforcement vessel fired on an unarmed human cargo ship, killing 11 crew members. She sat in front of the Earth Assembly and said the same thing. Not yet. People had called her a coward. People had called her things worse than that. She accepted it. She kept filing complaints. She kept documenting everything. Over 22 years, she built a record so complete and so precise that every violation, every broken promise, every death, and every stolen territory had a file number and a date and a chain of evidence that could be presented in any court in the galaxy. And then, on a Thursday, she sealed that record, signed the letter with her hand, and pressed her family's old wax stamp into the red seal, a stamp that had no official meaning. She just liked the weight of it, and she sent it. When her assistant asked if she was sure, Lena Marsh looked out the window at the city below and said, "I've been certain for 6 years. I was just waiting until we were ready." Her assistant asked, "Are we ready?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She watched a bird land on the window ledge, look around, and fly away. "SYMJHY," she said. She had picked up the phrase from a human language she had studied years ago, and she used it sometimes when English felt too blunt. It meant roughly, "Enough for me now." Or more precisely, "I have done my part. The rest is already in motion." Then she went home and cooked dinner and called her daughter, and did not sleep very well, which was the most human thing about her, and also the most honest. The Concilium's response to Lena's letter came on day 11 of the 90-day window. It was not the response anyone had expected. The High Chamber did not take the letter seriously, not as a genuine threat anyway. What they took it as was an opportunity. A primitive species issuing dramatic ultimatums was, in their experience, a sign of internal political pressure. The human government was probably dealing with some domestic unrest. The letter was a performance for their population. If the Concilium responded harshly, it would validate the human government's narrative. If they responded dismissively, it might destabilize Earth's leadership. The correct move, their strategists agreed, was to respond with calibrated condescension, acknowledge the letter just enough to show they had read it, offer nothing, and make the humans feel heard without giving them anything real. They sent Ambassador Prussian, a title, not a name, for a senior Concilium envoy whose actual name was a sound humans couldn't make, to Earth with a delegation of 40. The ambassador arrived with great ceremony, expecting cameras and crowds and the theater of importance that primitive species usually performed for galactic attention. The ambassador was met, at the landing platform, by a single human woman in a plain gray jacket. No cameras, no crowds, no ceremony. It was just Lena Marsh, holding a tablet under her arm and a coffee that she had apparently brought for herself and not for anyone else. The ambassador's translator conveyed the formal greeting. Lena nodded. She handed the ambassador's senior aide a document, printed, again, on paper, and said, "These are the 31 specific violations we are formally closing out. You'll find each one has a suggested remedy and a deadline. The deadline is the same as the letter. Day 90. The ambassador asked, through the translator, what would happen on day 90 if the remedies were not met. Lena looked at him the way you look at someone who has asked you to explain a sunrise. The letter was clear, she said. I have nothing to add to it. She turned and walked back inside. The ambassador stood on the landing platform for a moment, unsure what had just happened. In 40 years of diplomacy, he had never been handed a piece of paper and walked away from. It was such a strange gesture, so unperformed, that it took him several minutes to identify the emotion it produced in him. It was the first time in this entire conflict that he felt something adjacent to concern. He sent a report back to the High Chamber. The human representative is unusual. Recommend we take the document seriously. The High Chamber filed his report in a category they had for excessive field caution. Day 11 became day 20. Day 20 became day 40. The document sat on a desk in the high chamber unopened. There is a concept in human military and strategic thinking called strategic ambiguity. It is the deliberate practice of being unclear about your capabilities so that your opponents cannot calibrate their response to you. You don't show your full hand. You don't even hint at it. You let people assume you are less than you are, and you let that assumption do its work, and you wait. Earth had been practicing strategic ambiguity for 60 years. Not deceptively. Not with malice. It had started as a genuine limitation. When humanity first reached space, they truly were fragile and slow and underpowered. But humans learned. And as they learned, they made a collective, quiet decision that their advisors and historians and strategic thinkers had pushed for it across 3 generations. Do not show what you have become. Not because they wanted to deceive anyone, but because they had read enough history, their own and everyone else's, to know that a civilization that reveals its military growth too early gets preemptively targeted. Every galactic power that had risen fast had been met with a coalition designed to stop them before they became unstoppable. Earth strategists had a name for this pattern. They called it the tall tree problem. Lightning strikes the tallest tree in the forest first. So Earth stayed a 7 on the Vathali scale. They never updated their registration. They never showed their new ships, which were no longer fragile, which had been quietly redesigned over 40 years by engineers who had studied every piece of alien technology they could legally and illegally acquire, and then improved on it. They never showed their defense grid, which now covered every human system with interlocking layers that had been stress-tested in simulation against every known galactic weapon type. They never showed their biological research division, which had spent 30 years quietly solving the problem of what human bodies needed to survive extended conflict, and had solved it. They filed complaints instead. 947 complaints. Each one a data point. Each one a test. Each one was designed to show the concilium exactly who they were dealing with in legal terms: meticulous, patient, precise, willing to play by the rules, while hiding everything else. Vethorum, the translator who had sat on the floor when he read Lena's letter, had figured the problem out on day 3 of the 90-day window. He had gone back through all 947 complaints and read them not as grievances, but as architecture. They were building something with those complaints, a legal and moral framework so airtight that when the 90 days ended, Earth would not be the aggressor. They would be the party that had exhausted every peaceful option. In galactic law, that distinction mattered enormously. He wrote a second report. He sent it to 7 different offices. He titled it, "We are not dealing with A7." None of the 7 offices responded. On day 60, Vethorum did something that cost him his career and would later make him the most famous translator in galactic history. He sent the report directly to the Urathi Expansion Authority, the Delvari Trade Collective, and 14 independent systems, bypassing the High Chamber entirely. He included a cover note that said simply, "You should know what is coming." 11 days before the deadline, things began to change. This was not because the concilium had finally read the document, not because anyone in power had listened to Vethorum. Change came, as it often does, from the edges. A Urathi colony administrator named HFY, the 4th of 7 cloned administrative units, distinguished from her siblings by a small scar above her left optical cluster that she had received in a childhood accident and had chosen not to repair because she liked being distinguishable, received Vethorum's forwarded report and read it in a single sitting. HFY was not a soldier. She was an administrator. She managed crop allocation and infrastructure maintenance for a mid-tier colony on a moon called Urbessel. She had never thought much about Earth. The human colony that her ancestors had displaced existed before she was grown. It was history. She read Vethorum's report, and then she pulled up the file on the original displacement, the human colony on what had been called New Kepler. She read the human's account of the event. Then she read her government's account of it. Then she sat with the gap between those 2 accounts for a very long time. She sent a private message to her senior, a being called the Urathi District Coordinator, and she said, "We need to discuss New Kepler. I believe we have a legal and moral obligation that we have not met, and I believe the consequences of continuing to not meet it are now imminent." The district coordinator told her to focus on crop allocation. HFY sent the same message to the next level up. And then the next. She used every formal channel available to her over 11 days, with an efficiency and documentation discipline that would have impressed Lena Marsh, and she was ignored at every level until, on day 88, her message reached a Urathi council member named Grain, who was old enough to remember the original expansion debates and had always privately thought New Kepler had been a mistake. Grain made a call, not to the Concilium, to Earth. He asked, through several layers of intermediaries, whether Director Marsh was still available for a conversation. Lena Marsh took the call in her office, at her desk, with her coffee. She had 2 days left on her window. Grain, through translation, said, "I want to ask what it would take, at this stage, for Earth to consider a partial remedy on the New Kepler matter. I understand the larger framework. I am asking about this specific point." Lena was quiet for a moment. She looked at the file on her screen. New Kepler, complaint number 4, filed 30 years ago, the first one, the one that had started everything. She said, "Full restitution of the original territorial boundary and a formal apology entered into the galactic record." That was always the ask. It hasn't changed. Grain said he would need time. Lena said, "You have 48 hours." Grain said that was not much time. Lena said, very quietly, "Caro. It's what remains. Use it." Grain used it. On day 89, while Grain was working the internal Urathi political channels with a desperation nobody on the outside could see, someone leaked what Earth actually had. Not Lena. Not Earth's government. Someone inside the Military Architecture Division. A young engineer named Pete Calloway who had worked on the defense grid for 6 years and had watched the 90-day clock tick down and had decided that the Concilium deserved to know exactly what they had chosen not to prevent. He didn't leak weapons schematics. He didn't reveal tactical positions or operational plans. What he released was a single technical overview document, 6 pages, describing in broad terms the nature and scale of what Earth's defense and deterrence capability had become. It moved through the galactic information networks in under 4 hours. By the end of that day, 14 governments had read it. The document described, in precise and unexcited language, the following: that Earth's primary defense grid was not defensive in the traditional sense, but was a systemic denial architecture, meaning it did not simply protect human space but could, when activated, create interference patterns that disrupted faster-than-light navigation across a corridor of space approximately the width of the galactic arm's inner rim. Not permanently. Not with physical destruction. But for a period of 6 to 8 months, any civilization that relied on standard FTL transit through that corridor, which included the Urathi primary supply lines, 3 of the Delvari trade routes, and the Concilium's fastest communication relays, would be effectively isolated. It was not a weapon. It was a lock. Earth had built a lock, and it held the only key, which was on the door that every major galactic power needed to walk through to keep their civilization running. The document did not say we will use this. It did not threaten. It simply described what existed. The Concilium High Chamber, reading the document, felt for the first time in 31 years what it was like to receive information and have no appropriate category to file it in. This behavior was not typical of a primitive species. This was not a 7. A 7 didn't build systemic denial architectures. A 7 didn't hold a galactic corridor hostage without a single weapon being fired or a single threat being uttered. A 7th didn't spend 31 years filing complaints with the quiet, deliberate patience of someone who already knew how the ending went and was simply making sure the record was clean before it arrived. The head of the High Chamber, a being named Osaveth Principal, convened an emergency session. She asked her senior strategic analyst, "What is the human score on the Vathali scale?" The analyst ran the calculation with the new information. He came back an hour later. He said, 38. Osaveth, the principal, said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "Get me Lena Marsh." Lena was in her apartment when the Concilium call came through, the first direct high chamber communication Earth had ever received. She was eating dinner alone. She moved the plate to the counter, sat back down at the table, and took the call on her personal tablet without changing her clothes or adjusting her expression. Osaveth Principal appeared on screen in her full formal regalia, which was an elaborate garment of layered silver and black that communicated, in concilium cultural terms, maximum institutional authority. She was flanked by 8 senior advisors. The background was the high chamber itself, a vast circular room with bioluminescent walls that pulsed faintly with something between light and sound. It was designed to communicate power and permanence. Lena was in her kitchen in a sweater. Osaveth, the principal, started, with the help of a translator, by giving the usual formal greeting, recognizing each other, stating their positions, and confirming that the way they were communicating was valid. Lena waited for it to finish. Then she said, "Hello. I have 23 hours left on my window. What did you want to discuss?" Osaveth, the principal's translator, rendered this. The principal and her advisors exchanged a look that crossed species lines cleanly. It was the look of people recalibrating. The principal said, "We want to discuss the possibility of renewed negotiation frameworks." Lena said, "There are 31 specific violations in the document we delivered on day 11. Your ambassador never opened it. The remedies haven't changed. I'm happy to work through them one at a time, but I want to be direct with you. There are items on that list that have deadlines inside the 90 days. The territorial matter on New Kepler currently has a separate conversation with the Urathi that may or may not resolve before tomorrow morning. If it resolves, it comes off the list. If it does, it leaves, and the weight of the remaining list stays the same." The principal said, "You're telling me a list of 30 violations can be resolved in 23 hours. Lena said, "No. I'm telling you some of them can't. The ones that can aren't going to be resolved by talking. They were never going to be resolved by talking. Those ones I'm prepared to address through other means. And those means are the architecture described in the leaked document," the principal said. "I didn't confirm or deny that document," Lena said. "You didn't deny it either." "No," said Lena. "I didn't." There was silence on the line. The bioluminescent walls behind the principal pulsed slowly. Lena took a bite of her dinner. The principal watched her do this and appeared, for a moment, genuinely uncertain how to respond to a human eating during a high-chamber communication. "What do you want, Director Marsh?" the principal finally asked. "Not the list. Not the framework. What do you actually want?" It was the first honest question the Concilium had ever asked Earth. Lena set down her fork. She looked at the screen for a moment before she answered. "I want the last 31 years to have meant something," she said. 947 complaints. 40,000 people moved off their land. 11 crew members killed on an unarmed ship. I want those things on the galactic record as wrongs that were committed and acknowledged. Not quietly filed. Not processed. Acknowledged. I want the Concilium to stand in front of the galaxy and say what happened." The principal said, "That is a significant political request." "Yes," said Lena. "It is. And if we do that, if we meet the items that can be met and formally acknowledge what happens at hour 90? Lena looked at her food getting cold. "Nothing," she said. "That's the whole point. The reckoning was always an acknowledgement. I never wanted a war. I wanted a record." While Lena was on the call with the High Chamber, Sesek 4 was awake on your vessel, watching the dawn come up over the crop field she managed, waiting for word from Grain. She had done everything she could. She had moved every paper and knocked on every door available to her from her position. She was an administrator of a mid-tier colony. She had no authority over territorial decisions, no power in the council chambers, no leverage beyond the force of a well-documented argument, and an old council member who thought New Kepler had been a mistake. She watched the dawn and tried not to calculate how many hours were left. The message from Grain came at the same time the light hit the far edge of the fields, a coincidence of timing that she would remember later, when people asked her about this day. The message said, "Council has approved the formal territorial restitution of the New Kepler boundary. A formal apology into the galactic record is pending final wording review, expected within 6 hours." "You were right. I'm sorry it took this long." Sesek 4 read it twice. She sat down on the ground, not from shock, the way Vethorum had, but simply because her legs felt suddenly like they were made of something lighter than usual, and sitting seemed like the right response to a weight being lifted. She thought about the humans who had lived on New Kepler. She didn't know their names. She had read the displacement records, dry administrative language about relocation and resettlement and transition support. Language designed to make something that happened to 40,000 people sound like a logistics project. She pulled up a different file. The human complaint number is 4. Filed by a man named Thomas Riggs, who had been the elected representative of the New Kepler colony. He had filed the complaint within 30 days of the displacement. He had attached, at the end of the legal document, a single photograph. A house. Small and wooden, with a garden in front and hills behind it. This is the kind of photograph you take when you know you're leaving and want to remember what you are leaving behind. Thomas Riggs had died 14 years ago. He never saw the complaint acknowledged. HFY sat in the field with the new light coming in and thought about Thomas Riggs's house and felt something that she did not have a precise word for in her language, a sorrow that was also a debt, a grief that was also a responsibility. She filed a personal note into the New Kepler restitution record. This resolution is owed in part to the patience of people who will not see it. Their record made it possible. Let the record include that. Nobody asked her to do that. She did it because it was true, and because truth filed into a record is the smallest form of justice, and also sometimes the only form available. With 1 hour remaining on the window, 6 things happened in quick succession. The Urathi formal restitution of New Kepler's territorial boundary was entered into the galactic record, with apology, with the exact wording Lena had specified 30 years ago in complaint number 4. The Delvari Trade Collective, who had spent the previous 18 hours in emergency session after reading Pete Calloway's leaked document, formally dissolved the tariff walls on human commercial routes and sent a terse 3-line communication to Earth's trade office that was technically an apology in Delvari cultural terms and technically nothing in anyone else's. The Concilium High Chamber released a formal public statement acknowledging, by name and number, the 947 complaints Earth had filed and stating that they represented documented violations of galactic treaty frameworks and that each one constituted a harm to the Earth civilization that had not been appropriately addressed. Vethorum, who had been suspended from his position for bypassing the High Chamber in sending his report, was reinstated with back pay by order of Osaveth Principal, who cited his work as the single most important piece of strategic analysis produced in the last decade. Pete Calloway, the engineer who had leaked the defense grid overview, was simultaneously facing an internal inquiry and being quietly nominated for a civilian service commendation by 3 different Earth government offices, which was such a perfect summary of how institutions process inconvenient heroism that the people in Lena's office stopped pretending to work and just laughed for a few minutes. Lena Marsh sat at her desk, reading through the confirmations as they came in, checking them against the list, marking each one closed, and not feeling triumph. She had expected to feel something larger than what she felt. She had imagined, sometimes, in the long, quiet years of filing and waiting, that there would be a moment of satisfaction so complete that it would justify all of it. What she felt was more like the end of a long walk. Not euphoria. Not vindication. Just the particular quietness of having arrived somewhere you had been walking toward for a very long time and looking around and recognizing the place. She marked complaint number 947 as closed at 53 minutes before the window ended. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went to find her assistant, who had been awake for 36 hours. "Go home," she said. "We're done for today." The reckoning, when people discussed it later, was always described as a war that didn't happen. Historians debated whether it had been a strategic masterpiece or an enormous risk that had simply landed well. They analyzed the defense grid, the complaint architecture, the timing of the leak, the role of HFY, the role of Vethorum, and the specific wording of Lena's letter. What they argued about most was the question of whether Earth had ever truly intended to activate the lock. The answer was nobody fully knew. The lock existed. The capability was real. Whether Lena Marsh had a genuine activation order prepared and would have issued it at hour 90, whether the cool, still woman in the gray jacket had been 6 seconds away from isolating a galactic corridor and watching civilizations fracture, nobody could say with certainty. Lena never answered that question directly. In the single long-form interview she gave, 2 years after the 90-day window closed, the interviewer asked, "Were you going to do it if the concilium hadn't called?" Lena was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. She said, "I think the most important thing I ever did was make that question unanswerable. If they knew I wouldn't, the threats were meaningless. If they knew I would, they'd have found a way to neutralize us before hour 90. The uncertainty was the policy. The uncertainty was the whole point." The interviewer asked if she slept well during those 90 days. Lena smiled, a rare event, people noted, for a woman whose face was usually committed to neutrality. "No," she said. "Not at all." The galactic record after the resolution was different in ways both large and small. The concilium reformed its complaint review process, quietly, without fanfare, in a way that might have been substantive change or might have been bureaucratic theater, and only time would reveal which. The Delvari trade routes opened, and human commerce recovered slowly, the way economies always do, not with a clean snap back to health, but with the long, grinding process of rebuilding trust between buyers and sellers who remembered being on opposite sides of a wall. In territorial terms, a new Kepler was returned. The land was there. The infrastructure was gone. The original colonists had built lives elsewhere. Some of them came back. Most didn't, because 30 years changes people the way it changes everything, not erasing what was there before, but growing over it, through it, until the original shape is still somehow present inside the new one. Thomas Riggs's house was gone. Someone built a different house on the same land, and they planted a garden in front of it, without knowing why. That felt like the right thing to do. 3 years after the window closed, Lena Marsh retired. She did it on a Tuesday with no announcement and no ceremony. She cleaned out her desk, which didn't take long because she had never kept much in it.
A mug.
A small photograph of her daughter. A copy of complaint number 4, Thomas Riggs's document, with his photograph of the house attached, that she had kept in her top drawer for 20 years. She had read it more times than she could count. She had never filed it away. She put it in her bag. She walked out of the office building where she had spent most of her adult life, nodded to the security officer at the door. A young man named Derek, who had worked the morning shift for 4 years and always had coffee ready, which was the kind of thing Lena noticed and never said anything about but also never forgot, and walked to her car. She sat in the car for a few minutes before starting it. She thought about all the things she had held still for. All the patience that had been asked of her. By strategy, by principle, by the slow and infuriating reality that some things cannot be rushed without being ruined. She contemplated the individuals who faced displacement, death, and lost possessions during her wait. She thought about whether waiting had been the right choice and would never be fully sure. That was the honest answer, the only answer worth having. She thought about HFY, whom she had never met, but whose note in the new Kepler restitution record she had read. This resolution is owed in part to the patience of people who will not see it. Lena had found that sentence more moving than any formal acknowledgement the concilium had issued. It was the only thing anyone had said in all of that time that felt like it had been written by someone who understood what it had actually cost. She had sent HFY a message once. A short one. It said, "Thank you for reading the file." HFY had written back, "Thank you for making it impossible to look away." Lena started the car. She had no plans, which was unusual for her, and she felt strange, which was also correct. She had been planning for 31 years. She thought she might drive somewhere without a destination for a while. She thought she might look at something that had nothing to do with any record, any complaint, any window or deadline, or any carefully worded document. She thought she might just drive and let the road be what it was, unscheduled, unarchived, belonging to nobody, going somewhere she hadn't decided yet. HFY, she thought. My part is done. The rest belongs to whatever comes next. She pulled out of the parking lot, turned left for no particular reason, and drove into a Tuesday afternoon that was, for once, entirely hers. Yendi.